The sun cut sideways across Redstone Crossing that Tuesday afternoon. It always did this time of year, like it was looking for an angle no one had prepared for. He had ridden down from the high ridge for salt and coffee. That was the plan. That was all it was supposed to be. Inside Grubb's general store, the air was thick with tobacco and old sweat, but something sharper sat underneath. The silence of men who had already chosen not to see. She stood in the center of it. Shoulders set from years of work that asked too much. Eyes fixed on the floorboards, 3 feet in front of her boots. Hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. She had stopped looking for a way out. She was already somewhere else. The silver-haired man said loud for the room, last call for the girl. Cooks, cleans, hauls water. Her daddy's debt came due. Fair's fair. Low laughter moved through the crowd. The storekeeper turned away and began examining a coil of rope with great interest. The 2 men near the door straightened, thumbs hooked in their belts. 4 steps. Then 5, the stranger crossed the floor and stopped. He reached into his vest for the money. He rode into Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to anyone else. But to Holt Brannan, Tuesday was the day he allowed himself to come down from the ridge. Once every few months, long enough to get what he needed, short enough to remember why he left. Salt, coffee, lamp oil. Maybe a new whetstone if Grubbs had one that wasn't already rusted through. That was the list. That was supposed to be the whole day. The trail down from Red Rock Ridge took the better part of a morning. He knew every section of it, every loose patch of shale on the upper switchbacks, every place where the ground turned soft after rain, every tree that had fallen across the path in the 6 years since he'd built the cabin and started making this particular descent. He knew it the way you know a thing you've done alone, repeatedly, without anyone watching. Not performing the knowledge, just having it. The way your hand knows a door handle in the dark. 6 years. He hadn't meant it to be 6 years when he left. He'd meant it to be a season. Maybe 2. Long enough to let the situation in Denison resolve itself. Through the courts. Through someone with more tolerance for the kind of compromise required. Through the slow grinding machinery of institutional accountability that he had once believed in enough to stake his career on. None of those things had happened. The situation in Denison had resolved itself the way situations resolve themselves when the people in charge of resolving them are also the people who created them. Quietly, favorably. In a direction that did not involve consequences for anyone who mattered. Holt had found out about it from a trader, passing through his 2nd winter on the ridge. A man named Carew, who came through every few months with coffee and news and the particular energy of someone who has spent too long moving between isolated places and values and conversations more than most people value money. Carew had told him about Denison the way he told everything, matter-of-factly, without particular weight on any piece of it. The land consortium had gotten what they came for. The federal survey had been adjusted. The man Holt had worked under for 5 years, a man named Delbert Cray, who had a family photograph on his desk and always remembered the names of the people he was speaking to, and had spent those 5 years building Holt's trust with the patience of an irrigation project, had died 3 winters later, broke, alone, in a boarding house in a town 200 miles from Denison. Good, Holt had said, and meant it, and gone back inside his cabin and sat by the fire and stayed there for the better part of 2 days. Understanding for the first time that what he'd felt when he left Denison, the hollow, specific weight of having walked away from something that needed him, was not going to resolve itself the way he'd hoped, was not going to be lifted by justice or outcomes, or the grinding machinery of accountability. It was just going to be there every day, until something changed. He tied his horse outside Grubb's general store and pulled his hat down against the afternoon glare. The sun in Redstone Crossing always came in sideways this time of year. Like it was trying to get a better look at you from an angle you hadn't prepared for. He'd been particular about things like that since Denison. Angles, approaches, the specific quality of silence that meant nothing was wrong versus the specific quality of silence that meant something was about to be. Cray had taught him that. The reading of rooms, of situations, of the space between what people said and what they were actually communicating. The terrible irony being that those same skills had eventually let him read Cray himself with sufficient accuracy to understand what was happening long before anyone else had noticed. He pushed through the door. The smell hit him first. Tobacco, old wood, sweat that had been there long enough to become part of the walls. And underneath it, something sharper, something that didn't belong to the building. Tension. The store was crowded for a Tuesday afternoon. 8 men, maybe 9. Miners mostly, a couple of ranch hands. One man in the corner who had the particular stillness of someone paid to stand in corners and look like he wasn't paying attention. Holt cataloged all of them in the time it took him to let the door close behind him. Old habit, the kind that doesn't leave just because you stopped doing the job that built it. He moved toward the supply counter along the far wall. Nodded at Grubbs, who nodded back in the way of men who had a professional understanding. You don't ask questions, I don't cause trouble. We both go home. Grubbs was a practical man. He had a business to run and a family to feed, and he had survived in Redstone Crossing by understanding which situations required his involvement and which ones required him to be very busy, examining something at the other end of the store. He was reaching for the shelf when he heard the voice, $20, loud, deliberate. The kind of loud that wasn't about volume. It was about audience. The kind of man who says things loudly because he wants witnesses. Because witnesses make a transaction legitimate. Because if enough people see something happen and don't stop it, it becomes the kind of thing that happened. $20 and she's yours. Cooks. Cleanse Hall's water. Strong back. Won't find better value for the price. Holt didn't turn around immediately. He had learned a long time ago that turning around immediately was how you signaled interest before you'd decided if you had any. So he stood there for a moment with his hand still on the shelf, reading the room without looking at it, listening to what the silence underneath the voice was telling him. The silence underneath was telling him something he didn't like. He turned. Virgil Crane stood in the center of the store, 55 years old, built wide and carrying it, with the confidence of a man who'd never had reason to doubt his own weight in any sense of the word. Silver hair combed back, vest pressed, boots clean despite the dust outside, which meant he had someone clean them for him, which meant he was the kind of man who always had someone to do that. 2 men flanked him at a distance, not close enough to be obvious, close enough to be there when needed. Holt assessed them both in the same second he assessed the room. The one on the left was younger, twitchier, the kind of nervous that comes from wanting to prove something. The one on the right was older and still, more dangerous. And in front of Crane, slightly to his left, was a girl. Young, 20, maybe. Hard to tell because the life on her face had been packed down by something heavy and recent. Brown hair pulled back with no concern for how it looked. A gray dress that had been washed so many times the original color was anybody's guess. An apron, with a grease stain on the left side that hadn't come out. She was large. Not the kind of large that people talk about, in the careful ways they talk about it. Lowering their voices, choosing softer words, as if the person in question couldn't see their own reflection and needed to be protected from a truth they were already living. Large in the real sense. Broad shoulders. Solid frame. The kind of body that had done actual work for its actual living, and showed every bit of it. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her eyes were fixed on a spot on the floorboards, approximately 3 feet ahead of her boots. She wasn't looking at Crane, wasn't looking at the room, wasn't looking at the men who were shifting and murmuring around her like this was entertainment, like she was something to be appraised rather than someone to be spoken to. She had gone somewhere else. Holt recognized it immediately. Had seen it before, not often, but enough. In men who'd been through things they hadn't fully come back from. The body stays present because it has to. The breath continues because there's no mechanism to stop it. The hands stay still, and the eyes fix on a neutral point, and the whole apparatus of personhood retreats somewhere interior and quiet, somewhere that costs nothing to be, and waits. Waits for it to be over. Waits for whatever comes next. Waits because waiting is the only thing left that costs nothing. He looked at her hands, clasped tight enough that the knuckles were pale. Not shaking, which somehow made it worse. Shaking would have been reaction. Shaking would have been the body insisting on its own distress. The stillness was something past that. Something that it already made peace with. The fact that distress was not going to change anything. "Last call," Crane said, turning slightly to play to the room. $20 for the Fuller girl. Her daddy's debt came due. She's worked 2 years toward it, and here we are. Fair's fair. A couple of men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Holt looked at Grubbs. Grubbs was very busy, examining a length of rope that had apparently become the most interesting thing in the room. His jaw was set in the way of a man who has decided that what's happening in front of him is not his problem. Working hard to maintain that position against the considerable evidence that it is everyone's problem. He looked back at the girl. She still hadn't looked up, and that was the thing that did it. Not the spectacle of it, not the cruelty, exactly, though that was present in sufficient quantity. It was the specific quality of her absence from the room, the fact that she wasn't scanning. Wasn't looking for exits or help or someone's eye to catch. Most people in a bad situation keep looking. Because hope is resilient that way. It keeps searching even when it should have given up. Even in the worst circumstances, some part of a person keeps checking. Maybe this time, maybe that corner, maybe that face in the crowd. The reflex toward rescue runs very deep. She wasn't running it. She had already decided there was nothing to find. That decision, that certainty, was what did it, not pity. Holt Brannon was not a man who did things out of pity. Pity was soft on, warm, and lived in the chest and led to actions that were about the person doing the pitying more than the person being pitied. What he felt was something colder and more structural. The specific feeling of watching something happen that should not be allowed to happen. Not because of sentiment, not because of how it made him feel. Because some things are wrong the way 2 + 2 being 5 is wrong. Not emotionally, mathematically. He walked across the store. He counted out 4 steps before Crane noticed him. 5 steps before the 2 flanking men, straightened slightly. 6 steps, and he was close enough that stopping felt intentional. $20, Holt said. Not a question, not an offer exactly. A statement of the price he'd heard stated. He was confirming the arithmetic before he committed to it. A habit from his years in federal investigation. Muttered. You don't assume you've heard correctly until you've verified. Assumptions cost you. Crane looked him over with the careful assessment of a man who has sized up strangers and mostly come out ahead. What he saw. Lean man, 40 years old, trail-worn, face like dried leather under the hat brim. Hands that had seen work. Eyes that had seen more than the hands. Not large. Not particularly threatening at first glance. But there was something about the stillness of him. Not the stillness of nervousness. Or deference. The specific quality of stillness that isn't calm. It's controlled. The stillness of a man who has been in rooms where violence happened, and knows exactly what that costs, has run that calculation 100 times, in 100 different rooms, and has already done it again right now, and arrived at an answer he's comfortable with. Crane held his gaze for a half-second longer than he wanted to. That's what I said, Crane replied. You interested or just listening? I'm paying it. The room shifted, not loudly. The way air shifts when a window opens somewhere, and everyone feels the change before they know what caused it. Holt didn't look at anyone. Kept his eyes on Crane. Watching the calculation run behind those pale eyes, the assessment of risk, the weighing of public audience against private inconvenience, the final arithmetic that $20 in hand was worth more than the alternative he'd been planning. Whatever that alternative was. Holt noted it and set it aside. Problem for later. He counted the bills from the inside pocket of his vest. He had planned to use that money for winter stores. Coffee at the top of the list, salt, lamp oil, and a new whetstone if Grubbs had one that wasn't rusted. He had budgeted for exactly these things. A part of his mind registered this now with grim practicality and filed it away under problems for later, along with everything else that was becoming a problem for later. He placed the bills in Crane's hand without touching the man's fingers. If he could manage it. He managed it. Crane counted twice. Made a show of it. The theatrics of a man who wants everyone watching to understand that he's in control. That this transaction is proceeding on his terms. That the other man paying his due at his sufferance. He stepped aside with the theatrical ease of a man who'd just won something he hadn't deserved. She's yours. Holt turned to the girl. She was looking at him now. She had looked up at some point between the money changing hands and the words being said. Her eyes were green, a deep, specific green that didn't photograph well in the memory. The kind of color that you'd describe afterward as green, and know the description was insufficient. They were doing something complicated that took him a moment to parse. Not gratitude, not relief. Something faster and more precise than either of those. The look of a person who has just been handed a new variable and is running it through every calculation they've been running and checking whether it changes the result. She was reading him. The way you read a room before you walk into it. The way you read a contract before you sign it. The way you read a person when you have learned, at considerable personal expense, that people are either useful or dangerous, and the overlap between those two categories is more common than anyone likes to admit. He held her gaze, didn't smile, didn't offer reassurance, didn't perform anything. Performance was for people who needed the other person to feel something specific. He didn't need her to feel anything specific. He needed her to have accurate information, ma'am, he said. I'm going to walk outside now. You can come with me or you can stay here. That's up to you. Something moved across her face. Quick, almost imperceptible. The slightest adjustment in the calculation behind her eyes. I'll come, she said. Her voice was low and steady and asked for nothing. The afternoon light fell hard and sideways across the dirt main street of Redstone Crossing. Holt untied his horse. The roan shifted her weight and regarded him with the mild skepticism she brought to most situations, and stood for a moment with his back to the girl. He needed a moment. Not much of one, but enough. What he had just done was not something he had planned. He had not ridden down from Red Rock Ridge with the intention of spending his winter supply money on a stranger's debt. He had not before this afternoon given Virgil Crane or the Fuller girl or the particular meanness of Redstone Crossing's economy any particular thought. He had been thinking about salt and coffee and whether the whetstone he'd been using was too far gone to sharpen properly. Now he was standing in the street with $20, less than he'd had 20 minutes ago, and a woman behind him who was either going to be a significant problem or a significant complication, and he wasn't yet certain there was a meaningful difference between those two things. He was also aware, and this was the part that required the moment, that he didn't regret it, not the expenditure, not the involvement, not the attention it had drawn from Crane's two men home, who were certainly watching from the doorway and reporting the situation to their employer, and would be having a conversation about next steps before the afternoon was out. He didn't regret any of it, which was itself worth paying attention to. I don't know your name, he said. Sadie. Sadie Fuller. Holt Brannon. He still didn't turn around. Not evasion, just. He needed to think about what he'd done without his face doing things he hadn't decided it should do. He had learned over the years, that his face was less controllable than the rest of him, and that certain kinds of thinking were better done when no one could read it. "I have a cabin," he said, "up on Red Rock Ridge, 3 days northeast. It's not much, but it's solid, and Crane doesn't know the trail up." He paused. What he was about to say mattered, not because of what it established legally or practically, but because of what it established between them. He needed her to have accurate information. He needed her to make a choice based on accurate information, not on whatever she assumed his motivations were. "I'm not buying anything from you. I need to be straight about that before we go any further." Silence behind him. He turned, because he needed to see her face when she answered. This kind of conversation required faces. You could hear a great deal in a voice, but you couldn't hear everything. The face filled in the gaps. She was standing very straight, hands at her sides now instead of clasped in front, the posture of someone who has made a decision and is inhabiting it fully. Her eyes were still running that rapid assessment, but it had not slowed exactly, changed direction. Like she'd recalibrated what she was looking for. "What do you want then?" she said. Fair question. He respected it immediately. Some people would have performed gratitude there, or relief, or some other reaction designed to make him feel good about what he'd done, and therefore less likely to attach conditions to it. She didn't do any of that. She asked the direct question. "Nothing," he said. "I saw something that needed stopping. I stopped it." She looked at him for a long moment. Men don't do things for nothing. Not angry. Not accusing. Stated the way you state that water runs downhill. A fact derived from sufficient observation of how the world actually operates, as opposed to how people claim it operates. "No," Holt agreed. "Most don't." She looked at him. He looked back. "I can work," she said finally. "I don't need to be carried. I don't." She stopped. Started again, her voice leveling into something more deliberate. "I won't be one more person who owes a debt they can't name. I heard you. I mean it." "I know you do," he said. "I understood you the first time." Her eyes changed. "Not trust. Not yet. Something smaller and more cautious than that. The first splinter of something that might become trust if it wasn't frightened away, before it had a chance to take a shape." He took the canteen from his saddle, held it out. "Drink. It's 3 days of trail and your feet need better wrapping than what you've got on them." She looked at the canteen, a flicker of something. Pride, maybe, or the reflex against accepting things she hadn't earned, and then it passed. She took it, drank without making a ceremony of it, handed it back. "I've walked worse than 3 days," she said. "Probably," he said. And they started walking. They didn't speak much during those first several hours. Holt led the roan. Sadie walked beside him, not behind, which he noticed and didn't remark on. The trail out of Redstone Crossing climbed steadily northeast, trading the flat dust of the valley floor for the thin scrub of the lower ridge country. Sage, juniper, rocks that caught the heat all day and released it slowly as the sun dropped. The kind of terrain that doesn't forgive inattention. Loose stone on the descents, hidden dips in the path, ground that looked solid and wasn't. She navigated all of it without asking for guidance. He watched her from the corner of his eye, the way a man watches something he's trying to understand without appearing to study it. It was a skill he'd developed in federal work. The peripheral catalog, the assessment that looks like not looking. Cray had been good at it too. Holt had spent years admiring the technique before he understood what it was being used for. She walked differently than he expected. He wasn't proud of his expectation, but honesty mattered even in the privacy of your own head. He'd expected someone her size to struggle with the elevation, to slow on the steeper sections, to need the brakes he was already planning to manufacture with sufficient theatrical plausibility that she wouldn't feel like a burden for requiring them. She didn't struggle. She adjusted. There was a meaningful difference between those two things. Struggling is fighting the terrain. Adjusting is reading it and responding. She planted her feet flat over loose rock, reducing her center of gravity, increasing traction. Shifted her weight forward on the ascents, back on the descents, automatically and without self-consciousness. Picked her line through the shale, not by instinct, but by looking, actually looking. The way someone looks when they're thinking, rather than just moving through space. She'd done trail work before, or something like it. Around mid-afternoon, when the heat had reached its worst and was beginning its grudging retreat, Holt stopped at a narrow creek. Summer low, barely more than a ribbon of water over pale stones, but running clean. He let the roan drink and crouched beside her, ostensibly checking the near hind shoe. The shoe was fine. He'd known it was fine. "Sit," he said, without looking up. "I'm fine. Sit anyway. I need to check the near hind shoe." It's been bothering her since the second mile, a beat of silence. He could hear her evaluating the statement, and then the sound of her settling onto the flat rock near the water's edge. He heard the cloth wrapping come off one foot, heard the small, sharp intake of breath as cold water hit skin that had been trapped in heat all day. After a moment, "You know the horse is fine. The rock's more comfortable than standing." Another pause. "True," she said. She put her other foot in the water. They stayed there for a few minutes. The creek made its small sound. Somewhere up the slope, a hawk turned slow circles in the thermals, too high to read anything off, just a shape against the pale sky doing what hawks do. "How long have you been up on that ridge?" she asked. 6 years. Alone? Yes, by choice. He looked up at her then, directly. Because the question deserved a direct answer, and because he wanted to see how she received it. "By choice," he said. She absorbed this the way she seemed to absorb most things, without visible reaction. But you could tell she was filing it, adding it to whatever picture she was building of who he was and what he wanted, and whether either of those things were likely to cost her something she wasn't willing to pay. "You rode 3 days down into town for supplies," she said. "Salt and coffee mostly. And you spent your supply money on me instead. I spent it on something that needed doing. I'll manage." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water moving over her feet. He stood up and went to the saddlebag and pulled out a strip of clean linen. He kept 3, old reflex from years of not knowing when a field bandage would be needed, and held it out toward her without ceremony. "For your feet. Better than what you've got." She looked at it, took it, wrapped her own foot efficiently, and without asking for guidance. The way someone does when they've been the only available caretaker for long enough that self-sufficiency has stopped feeling like a virtue and become simply the way things work. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and started walking. They didn't stop talking because there was nothing to say. They stopped talking because there was too much. A great deal of assessment happening on both sides. A great deal of filing and cataloging and building of models. And all of that work required the kind of concentration that conversation interrupts. He was learning her walk, the rhythm of it, the particular way she compensated for the terrain. He was learning that she was stronger than she looked and more experienced in the outdoors than her appearance suggested, and that she asked her body to do things it did without complaint and without performance. She, he suspected, was learning him with similar precision. They made camp before dark in a shallow hollow, where 2 boulders created a natural windbreak. Holt built a fire small, practical, no bigger than required, put water on to boil, divided the food he had without discussion. Jerky, hardtack, 2 dried apricots each. Not generous. Sufficient. Sadie sat on the opposite side of the fire and ate without ceremony. When she was done, she arranged herself, with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and looked at the fire, the way people look at fire when they're thinking hard about something they're not going to say yet. The night came in fast the way it does at elevation. Temperature dropped. Stars appeared in large numbers, the kind of sky you only get when there are no other lights for miles in any direction. "How did you end up with Crane?" Holt asked. He hadn't planned to ask it. He generally didn't ask questions that weren't his business. Another thing that had changed in him since Denison, the understanding that asking questions of people in difficult situations sometimes made them worse rather than better. But this one came out anyway. She didn't answer immediately. A branch popped in the fire. The hawk, or something like it called, once from somewhere up the slope, far away, and then went quiet. My father owed him money, she said finally. 3 years ago. Lost a land case. Judge ruled against him. Crane said there was still more owed on top of the land. Fees, interest. Things my father didn't understand well enough to dispute. She paused. My father died 14 months ago. Holt said nothing. He knew what the next sentence was going to be, and he wanted her to have the space to say it or not say it, whichever she chose. Crane said the debt transferred. That's how men like Crane work, Holt said quietly. The debt never quite reaches zero. No, you've known men like him. I've known the type. She watched him across the fire. What made you stop in there? You could have bought your salt and walked out. He thought about the comfortable kind of answer, the one that closed conversations. He'd built the last 6 years partly on the skill of constructing those exits, the short answer that satisfies the question without opening anything adjacent. He was good at it. He'd had a great deal of practice. You weren't asking for help, he said instead. That's what did it. Most people in a bad spot are still scanning, still looking for someone to notice. You'd already decided nobody was going to. You'd already gone somewhere else and made peace with it. He turned a stick in the fire. I've been that person. It's a hard place to be. Sadie was very still. That's a strange thing to admit, she said quietly. Probably, she looked back at the fire. After a long time, she said, I wasn't going to last much longer with Crane. You should know that. Not because I want you to feel like you saved me, I'm not saying it for that reason. I'm saying it because it's true, and I don't like owing a debt to someone based on a lie. You don't owe me a debt. I know that's what you think, and I know what I owe, she said. Quiet, definite. The voice of someone who has thought about this and arrived at a position and is not interested in negotiating it. I'll decide that part. He looked at her then, really looked, past the worn dress and the work-ruined hands, and the weight of whatever the last 2 years had cost her, and saw what was underneath, something iron-spined, something precise and proud in the way that quiet pride is. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that has probably been bent before and straightened itself out in the dark without asking anyone to witness the process. Fair enough, he said. The fire burned down. The temperature continued to drop. Holt settled on his bedroll, and Sadie arranged herself on the other side of the cold space where the fire had been. The blanket he'd given her pulled around her shoulders, her back to him, facing the slope above. They lay in the dark with the ridge wind, moving through the scrub, and the stars very clear and very bright and very indifferent. After a long time, when he was almost asleep, she spoke, Mr. Brannan. Holt. A pause, as if she was considering whether to use it, whether the use of it committed her to something she wasn't ready to commit to. Holt. Her voice was very quiet, not sleepy. Awake and thinking. What happens when we get to the cabin? He stared at the stars for a moment. At the Milky Way, doing what it does, being enormous and ancient and completely unconcerned with the particular questions of two people in a hollow on a ridge in the dark. You rest, he said. Then you figure out what you want to do next. Nobody tells you what that is. Silence. Just that. Just that. She didn't say anything else. He closed his eyes. The ridge was dark and wide and smelled of dry pine and cooling stone. Below them, Redstone Crossing sat in its own dust and its own particular meanness. Virgil Crane was already doing something. He could feel it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before the clouds show. Not clearly, not specifically, but in the bones, problem for the trail. Not for this moment. Right now, in this specific moment, there was a woman on the other side of the dead fire who was breathing slow and even. Not yet asleep. He could tell from the quality of the breathing. and a man on his back looking at the Milky Way and trying to remember the last time another person's breathing had been close enough to hear. 6 years was a long time. He didn't know what any of this was going to cost him yet. He knew it was going to cost something. The second morning came hard and fast. The way mornings do on the high ridge when the sun clears the eastern peaks all at once and turns the air from bearable to brutal in about 15 minutes flat. No gradual warming, no mercy of transition. Just night and then light and then heat. Holt was already up. He had been up since before first light. Old habit, the kind that sticks when you've lived alone long enough. That sleep starts feeling like a calculated risk, something you do when you've cleared enough variables to justify the vulnerability. He had water, boiling by the time Sadie stirred. He kept his back to her while she got herself together, because that seemed like the decent thing. Also because he didn't quite know what to do with his face in the mornings, and it was easier not to test it with an audience. Mornings had always been the time when his guard was lowest and his capacity for performed normalcy was thinnest. "Sleep well?" he said to the fire. Some, a pause, and the quiet sounds of someone trying not to take up too much space in someone else's morning. "Enough. That's enough." She came and crouched beside the fire and held her hands near the heat. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out without ceremony. She took it with both hands and didn't say thank you this time, which he found he respected more than when she had. They broke camp in 10 minutes. She rolled the blanket tight and fast, the same way he did, and tied it without being shown. She rewrapped her feet with the clean linen, taking more care with the left one, where the ground had been rougher on the descent yesterday. She stood up and looked northeast without asking which direction. He pointed. She started walking. Quiet with two people is a different thing than quiet alone. Holt had been alone on the ridge for 6 years. He knew every quality of silence. The silence before rain. The silence after a thought that goes too far. The silence of a morning that promises nothing will go wrong. He'd learned to read them, the way a river pilot reads water. This silence was different from all of those. This was the silence of two people who hadn't decided yet how much of themselves to offer and were proceeding carefully in the meantime. A functional silence, a working silence. The silence of two people doing the same thing in parallel and finding they could do it without interference. He kept noticing things he hadn't planned on noticing. The way she cataloged the terrain as she walked, her eyes moving along the ridge line in a slow, methodical sweep, building and updating the map in her head. Not with fear. With the careful attention of someone who understands that information is the cheapest form of insurance. The way she hit the steep sections, not charging, not hanging back. She found the pace that worked for the grade and held it with the precision of someone who has learned to budget energy over distance. She never asked how much farther. Around mid-morning, he said, "You've done trail work before." "Some. Where?" "My father used to bring me up the lower Red Rock trails when I was young." "Before," she paused. "Before we lost the land." She said it and kept walking. Didn't slow for the weight of it. The way you won't slow for something you've been carrying so long you've adjusted your gait. He thought about that for a while. What kind of man was he? "Your father." She walked 3 full steps before she answered. "The kind that meant well and caused harm anyway," she said, "which might be the worst kind. Because at least the ones who don't mean well can't disappoint you as deeply." Holt thought about that for a longer while. "That's a precise way to put it. I've had time to think about it." He almost smiled. He stopped himself before it arrived. He wasn't sure why, exactly. It wasn't that smiling felt wrong. It was more that he didn't want to do it accidentally, didn't want it to happen without him deciding it should. By noon, the trail had narrowed and steepened, shale patches that required careful footing. Holt took the roan's lead with both hands and picked the line, calling back the difficult sections without making it a lesson. Loose patch left of center. Rock shelf, a foot down. Shale runs out in 4 yards, wait for the granite. Sadie came behind him with one hand light, on the rock face for balance. Moving through the difficult sections, with a flat-footed patience that didn't look like patience. It looked like decision-making. Every step a considered choice. Then she slipped, not badly. Right foot on a round stone, weight shifted wrong, and she went down hard on one knee. Both palms hit the rock. Holt turned so fast, the roan shied. His hand was out before he'd decided to move it. She looked at his hand. 1 full second, the whole calculation running behind her eyes, the assessment of what accepting it meant. Then she took it, let him pull her up. Dropped it the moment she was standing. I'm fine. I know. I don't need. I know that too, he said. She looked at him with those green eyes doing their assessment. Whatever she was measuring, she hadn't finished measuring it. She looked back at the trail instead. Thank you, she said. To the trail rather than to him. Anytime, he said. To the horse rather than to her. They kept walking. That was the second day. The second night, Sadie helped set the camp without being asked. Not helping exactly, running a parallel track. While he tended the roan, she gathered the driest wood available and had a fire going by the time he came back. When he pulled out what food remained, she took half of it and sorted it by cook time. He let her, because she clearly knew what she was doing, and because watching her work was unexpectedly interesting. The economy of it. The way she moved through the task without wasted motion, without performance. You worked in a kitchen, he said. I worked in a lot of places. A kitchen specifically, she glanced up. How'd you know? The way you sorted the food, that's professional habit. Cooking order, not survival order. She was quiet for a moment. Hotel kitchen, down in Millhaven, for about 1.5 years, before my father got sick, before things changed. Yes, you liked it. Something moved through her expression, quick and unguarded. The way expressions are when a question lands somewhere you haven't pre-armored. I did, she said, and then seemed almost annoyed at herself for admitting it without more resistance. There was an order to it. You knew what a good meal was supposed to be, and you either made it or you didn't. Nobody could argue with the result. Unlike most things, she agreed. The food she made with what they had was better than it had any right to be. He ate all of it. Didn't say so, she noticed anyway. He could tell by the slight ease in the set of her shoulders when his plate came back empty. Afterward, the fire. The stars. The silence between them had changed over 36 hours. Not empty anymore. Not cautious exactly. Something in between that hadn't been named yet and didn't need to be. Why did you really leave Denison? She asked. 6 years ago. What made you go up there and stay? He'd been asked versions of this before. The trader Carew, a woman in the valley below who'd brought him eggs once and asked too many questions. He had short answers for both, the kind that closed conversations. I was a federal investigator, he said, based out of Denison for about 7 years. Good work. Work I believed in. He picked up a stick and turned it in the flame. The man I worked under decided the law was less useful than a particular arrangement he'd made with a land consortium operating in the southern corridor. I found out what he was doing. He knew I found out. Pause. I left because staying meant becoming something I couldn't live with, or dying before I had to make that choice. I picked the ridge. Do you regret it? Every single day, he said, and not at all. Depending on the hour, she absorbed this. Let it sit between them the way things sit when both people are treating them with the seriousness they deserve. Then, the people in Denison. What happened to them? The ones running the scheme got what they were after, for a while. Then the consortium dried up when the railroad changed routes. The man I worked under died broke 3 years ago. Heard it from a trader. A beat. Good, Sadie said. Flat, certain. No performance in it. He looked at her. She met his gaze without apology. Good, she said again. Quieter. He nodded once. Yeah, he said. I thought so too. On the third morning they were moving, before the gray had fully lifted. Holt had shaken her shoulder once. gently, stepping back as he did, because he'd noticed she slept like someone wired to come awake fast, and he was right. She was sitting up before his hand had finished the motion. 2 more hours of good trail, he said. Then it gets steep. Ready, she said. No ceremony. The third morning had a different quality. Something had settled between them over 2 nights and 2 days of trail. Not friendship exactly, not trust exactly. Something more functional than either. A working understanding of how the other person moved through space, and what they needed and what they didn't need, and what they would and wouldn't accept. Halfway up the steep section, she stopped. He heard it in the absence of her footsteps and turned. She was standing on a narrow ledge, looking east and below. Her face had gone very still, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of someone processing rapidly and wanting their face to stay out of the way while they did it. "What is it?" he said. She pointed east, below, where the trail dropped back toward the valley floor. 2 riders, moving northeast. "Same heading as them. How many people know this trail?" she asked. Her voice even, deliberately, carefully even. Holt's jaw tightened. "Not many. Crane's been through this country before. He didn't come himself. No. He sent someone." She looked at him. "Harlan Quist." He looked back at her. "You know that name." "I know his name, because I read 3 payment receipts for him in Crane's accounts, and saw him once outside the office door. Enough to know what he is." A beat of silence between them. "You've been holding a lot of things back," he said. "I hold things back until I know whether they're useful," she said. "Quist is useful to know about now. Fair." He turned back to the trail. "We move faster." She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She started climbing. They reached the upper ridge in under an hour, moving harder than he'd planned and faster than he'd wanted to push her. He watched her arrive at the top, breathing hard, jaw set, eyes going immediately to check the last position where the riders had been visible. "Gone," he said. "Lost them when we came over the ridge line. That doesn't mean they're not still coming." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She turned from the view and looked at him. The green eyes were doing the calculation again, but it had shifted in quality since Redstone Crossing. Less assessing him, more assessing the situation they were both in. "If that's Quist," she said, "he's not coming because of the $20. $20 isn't worth 3 days of riding." "No. He's coming because of what I know." Holt went still. "And what do you know, Sadie?" She held his gaze, and she told him she didn't tell it the way someone tells something they've been waiting to unburden themselves of. No relief in it. No performance of disclosure. She said it the way she said most things, flat and precise. Like reading from a document she'd memorized so thoroughly it no longer needed the paper to exist. For nearly 2 years, she said, she had worked as Crane's bookkeeper, not because she was trapped, exactly. Because she needed to be close to the documents. Because she needed time. Because she could read something once and keep it. Not all of it. Everything. Every number. Every name. Every date. Every transaction. One time through was all she required. In 2 years working for Crane, she said, I read his full accounts ledger 4 times. I read every contract that crossed the desk. I read the correspondence files twice. I read 3 letters that came in sealed and were supposed to go directly to him. Pause. I read them. Holt waited. She named the parcels. 12 land claims along the Southwater Corridor. Filed under dead men's names. Forged signatures on the homestead paperwork. A contact at the land office who processed the filings without asking questions. The plot numbers, the false names used on each filing, the specific amounts in the accounts ledger. The land, she said, was worth considerably more than it looked. Once the rail expansion came through, and it was coming, she'd seen the survey correspondence. The Southwater Corridor would become the primary access route for 3 mining operations. Triple the value, maybe more. He was watching her. The rhythm of her speech was different when she did this. Not the careful, measured cadence of someone thinking through what they were saying, but the slightly faster, more fluid rhythm of someone retrieving rather than constructing. Reading from an internal document. "And the letters," he said. "The letters," she said, "are the part that changes the size of this." And then she said the name, Judge Elias Morrow, the federal circuit judge. 20 years on the bench, plaques in courthouses, the grateful letters of upstanding citizens across 4 counties framed on office walls. The kind of man whose reputation had been built so carefully over so long that it had become a structure people leaned on without thinking about whether it could hold weight. 3 letters, she said. His handwriting, his signature. 2 of them discuss how certain land filings in the Southwater Corridor would be routed through his circuit for review, and how that review would come out. The 3rd one, she stopped, looked at the valley below. A moment of something, not grief exactly, but an adjacent thing. The specific feeling of naming something out loud that you've been carrying in silence for a long time. The 3rd one discusses a specific case. Filed 3 years ago. A land dispute between a smallhold farmer and Crane's holding company. He already knew, but he waited for her to say it. The case was Fuller versus Crane Consolidated, she said. My father's case. Morrow wrote to Crane confirming the judgment would go Crane's way, in exchange for $500, delivered in cash. The week before the hearing, silence on the ridge. The wind moved through the scrub below. The roan shifted her weight and breathed. The valley was still in gold in the midday glare. My father didn't lose that case. Sadie said. The case was sold. Her voice was even all the way through. That evenness cost something. He could see what it cost in the set of her jaw and in the particular stillness of her hands. The stillness of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that the muscles have adjusted, and the only way you can tell it's heavy is by watching what it takes, not to show it. You understand what you're carrying? Holt said carefully. Yes, you understand that Crane didn't send Quist up here because of $20 he sent him. Because I know about Morrow, she said. Crane can survive a land fraud case. With the right lawyers, enough delay, enough money. But Morrow doesn't survive exposure, and if Morrow goes down, he takes the whole system with him. Yes, she looked at him directly. The calculation in her eyes had resolved into something clearer. Not certainty exactly, but the focused clarity of someone who has been deciding for a long time and has finally chosen. I've known this since 14 months ago, she said. Since I read that letter. I've been deciding what to do with it ever since. I just needed to get far enough from Crane to decide. And I needed. She stopped. Corrected herself. Something in the correction that he noticed but didn't press. I needed someone to open the door. He looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The ridge wind moved. Whatever was riding northeast along the lower trail was still riding. Patient. Present. All right, Holt said, not loud, not dramatic. A man deciding something and saying so. Let's get to the cabin, she nodded. And Sadie, she looked at him. Whatever you decide to do with what you know, he said, you're not doing it alone. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind lifted the loose strands of her hair. The sun was overhead now, no mercy in it. You don't know me, she said. I know enough, he said. One more second. Then she turned and walked toward the last bend in the trail, and the set of her shoulders was different than it had been at the bottom. Still straight, still exact, still carrying everything she'd been carrying, but something had shifted, just slightly, just enough. Holt stood at the ridgetop for one more moment, looking east at the empty trail below. He turned and followed her. The cabin came around the last bend, low-roofed, stone-based, built by hand over 2 summers. The kind of structure that announces through its very existence that it has survived things. Not through grace or beauty, but through sheer refusal to cooperate with weather, time, and the particular loneliness of high elevation. It wasn't beautiful. It was solid. It was real. Sadie stopped when she saw it. Stood looking at it for a moment, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something that might have been relief, and might have been something more complicated than relief. "It's real," she said, almost to herself. "What did you think it was?" She shook her head slowly. "I didn't know. I still don't know what to think." A pause. "I stopped trusting things to be what they say they are." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not saying it as a complaint. I know you're not," she exhaled. Not a sigh. More like something releasing. Pressure that had been held past its capacity, finally given permission to go somewhere else. She walked the last 50 yards to the door. He came behind her and reached past her to lift the latch. She stepped inside, stopped in the center of the room, looked around at the spare, clean order of it, the single table, 2 chairs, the stone fireplace with its neat stack of split wood, the shelves of provisions along the left wall, the narrow bed against the back wall, the cabinet that held the rifle, and the cartridges, and the things he'd accumulated over 6 years of making a life in a small space. He watched her face and saw something happen there that was private and real. Something he didn't have language for. The specific expression of a person standing in a space that is exactly what it was promised to be, in a world that has not often kept its promises. He looked away. "Some things aren't yours to witness." He set his saddlebags down by the door. "The bed is yours," he said. "You don't have to. I sleep better by the fire. 6 years of habit. Don't argue with me about it." She closed her mouth. He pointed at the left shelf. "Provisions. Use whatever you need. Water barrel outside the east wall. I'll fill it from the upper spring tomorrow." He paused. "Rest today. Tomorrow you can tell me everything you remember. All of it, and we'll figure out what to do with it." Sadie turned from the shelf she'd been examining and looked at him. The expression he still hadn't fully decoded. Too many layers. All moving at slightly different speeds. "Why are you doing this?" asked. "The real version. Not what you told me on the trail." He thought about lying. He thought about the comfortable version. The deflection that sounds like honesty, but closes the door before anything important can get through it. "He was very good at those, because I left a town once when I should have stayed," he said. "And it has sat with me every single day since. And today I didn't leave." He held her gaze. "That's the real version." The fire was unlit. The room was warm anyway from the afternoon heat in the stones. Outside, the ridge wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. Sadie Fuller stood in the center of a stranger's cabin at the end of 3 days of trail, with the bruises still fading on her forearms, and the names of 12 stolen land parcels, and 3 letters from a corrupt judge, locked in a memory that had never once let her down. And 2 riders somewhere, in the valley below, who were almost certainly not going to stop riding. She stood there and looked at the man who had paid $20 for a principal and carried it 60 kaifals. And she said the only true thing she had left. "I don't know how to trust people," she said. "I haven't for a long time." "I know," he said, "but I'm going to try." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, not as a hope, as a decision, shoving and chosen. "So don't make me regret it." "I won't," Holt said. He meant it the way a man means something. When he's saying it to the only person within 50 miles who is actually listening. She nodded once, sat down in one of the chairs, put her head back against the wall. And in under a minute she was asleep, the deep, immediate sleep of someone whose body had been waiting for permission to stop. Holt stood in the doorway and looked east. The valley was still. The sky was pale and wide. Somewhere below, Harlan Quist was measuring distance. He turned away from the view, quietly put water on to boil. Whatever was coming wasn't here yet. He intended to use every hour he had. She slept for 4 hours. Holt tracked the light through the single east-facing window the way men do when they have nothing to do but wait and too much turning in their heads to waste the time on sleeping. The water he'd boiled had cooled and been reheated twice. He'd checked the roan, repacked the saddlebags, done a slow circuit of the cabin's exterior, reading the ground, the way 6 years of ridge living had taught him to read it, his own boot prints from this morning. The roan's hoof marks near the east wall. Nothing else. Not yet. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the valley below and thought about Denison. He didn't do this often, the deliberate revisiting of it. Mostly he avoided it. But today it seemed relevant in a way it hadn't for years. He had found out what Cray was doing on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Had sat with the knowledge for 4 days. 4 days of going to work, nodding at colleagues, filing the paperwork of an investigation that now felt like theater. 4 days of trying to figure out what to do with what he knew. He had told himself he was waiting for the right moment, for more evidence, for a cleaner way through that didn't require him to bring down the man he'd worked under for 5 years, the man who had taught him the better parts of his craft, the man whose daughter Holt had carried on his shoulders at the agency's summer picnic 2 years running. He had been lying to himself. He had been waiting because he was afraid. Not of Cray, of the aftermath. Of what happened to people who did the right thing in institutions where the right thing was inconvenient. He had seen it happen. He knew the shape of it, and so he had waited, and then he had left. And for 6 years he had told himself the leaving was a form of refusal, a principled withdrawal. He couldn't be part of it, so he removed himself. The girl in the chair across the room had spent 2 years doing something different. She had stayed. She had memorized. She had waited for the right moment, not because she was afraid, but because she was building a case. The distinction felt significant in a way he was still working out. When Sadie woke, it was the same way she'd come awake on the trail. Fast. Complete. No soft middle ground. She was upright before he'd moved from the chair. How long, she said. 4 hours. You should have. No reason to. Nothing moved on the eastern trail. She looked at her hands, flexed them once. Some private inventory of her body's current state and what it could be expected to do. Then she stood, went to the water basin, washed her face with both hands, and turned around. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He liked that she said it that way. Not "what do we do?" Tell me what you're thinking. As if she understood that thinking out loud was different from deciding, and that she wanted access to the thinking before the deciding happened. "I'm thinking that if those riders are Quist and someone Crane sent, they'll hit the lower ridge trail by tomorrow morning. The upper switchbacks are hard to find if you don't know them. That buys time. Not much. No," she came and sat in the other chair. The afternoon light fell across the table between them. "The evidence I have," she said, "is in my head. That's everything and nothing at the same time. Everything because no one can take it. Nothing because I'm one woman with no documentation and no corroborating witness. Any competent lawyer dismantles it. In 20 minutes, you need the physical documents, the ledger, the land filing copies, the letters." She looked at him steadily. "They're in Crane's office in Redstone. The ledger is in the left side locked drawer of his desk. The filing copies are in a metal box under the credenza against the back wall. The letters are inside the filing box, tied with cord at the bottom." He looked at her. "You've seen the office. I cleaned it every morning for 19 months. He should have stopped being surprised by what she'd retained. He wasn't anywhere close to stopping. "The drawer is locked," he said. "The key is on his watch chain, which he never removes." She paused. "But the lock is old. The mechanism is worn. A man who knew what he was doing could manage it without the key." The weight of what she was proposing settled between them. He got up, walked to the window, looked east. The trail below was empty and still and golden, with late afternoon light. He turned back. "If I'm not back in 3 days," he said, "you ride west. The old mining road off the north face drops down to Carver's Crossing. From there, a day's ride south gets you to Caldwell, where I find Marshal Ezra Taft, only Taft, no one else in that office. Why only Taft? Because I haven't verified who else might be on Crane's payroll. And I'd rather not find out the hard way." She absorbed this, filed it. "How will you get back without the horse?" "I'll get another horse in Redstone. Or walk the first 2 days down and ride the last." He watched her face. 2.5 days if I move. At night on the lower trail. She studied him with the focused attention of someone making a decision about whether to trust an unfamiliar structure before putting weight on it. You've done things like this before, she said. Federal investigation work occasionally involved retrieving evidence from locations where the evidence didn't want to be retrieved. The flattest possible description of what had been, in practice, a series of situations involving varying degrees of danger and improvisation. She recognized the flatness for what it was. He could tell from the slight compression at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. 3 days, she said. 3 days. He went to the cabinet along the back wall, took out the second rifle, older than his, heavier, but reliable. He checked the action, loaded it full, and held it out. She took it, checked the action herself, efficiently and without self-consciousness, the way someone does a familiar task. He set a box of cartridges on the table beside her, then stood for a moment, looking at the table, not at her. Because there were things pressing at the inside of his chest, and this was not the time, and he was. 6 years of ridge living had made him very good at not letting things be the time, Sadie. Don't, she said quietly. He looked at her. She was looking back at him. Arms at her sides, the rifle in her right hand. The afternoon light making everything in the room feel more solid and specific than it usually did. Don't say anything that makes this harder than it needs to be, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then, bar the door after I leave. Don't open it until you've confirmed who's on the other side. Upper Spring is northeast. I marked the trail with 3 stacked stones at each turn, I know. You told me the rifle shoots about an inch left at distance. Compensate right. Noted. I'll be back, she nodded. Not the nod of someone who believed it automatically. The nod of someone who had chosen to believe it, which was a different thing entirely. He left before something in his chest did something he wasn't prepared to manage in front of a witness. The ride back down to Redstone Crossing was faster alone and uglier. Holt pushed the roan harder than he liked and kept his mind on route and gradient and the specific locations of the bad sections on the lower trail. Off the cabin. Off the sound of a door being barred from inside. Off the image of Sadie Fuller sitting in that chair with a loaded rifle and 3 days to wait, which was the kind of image that once formed, had a tendency to occupy space. He was good at compartmentalizing. 6 years of solitude had made him excellent at it. You couldn't live alone in a high cabin for 6 years without developing the capacity to separate what needed your attention right now from what needed your attention eventually. The ridge demanded presence. The past demanded less than people usually gave it. But compartments have walls, and walls have pressure limits. His were being tested. He made the lower ridge by nightfall and kept moving. The roan was sure-footed enough in low light on familiar ground. He stopped twice, once to water her at the creek, once to check his bearings at the trail junction. He reached the outskirts of Redstone before noon the next day, came in from the west, avoided the main trail, left the roan at the livery, with a man named Corton, who asked exactly 0 questions, because Corton had always been professionally incurious. One of the more valuable qualities in a liveryman, in a town like Redstone, where questions sometimes led the kind of trouble that was bad for business. He stood in the alley beside the feed store and took stock. Crane's office, a clapboard building set back behind the general store, had 2 horses hitched outside, both hitched loose, the way horses get hitched when someone isn't planning to leave in a hurry. He watched for 10 minutes. Nobody came out. Nobody went in. He went around to the back of Grubbs' store. Grubbs himself was in the storage room. Crane been in? Holt said. Low. Grubbs looked up, looked at the door, looked back, left yesterday morning. Him and another man. Northeast, somebody said. He paused. Those horses outside his office, that's Breer and his associate, land business. Been waiting on Crane since yesterday. Getting unhappy about it, Holt's stomach dropped approximately 2 inches. He didn't show it. If Crane had gone northeast yesterday morning, the same direction they'd traveled, then the timeline had collapsed. Crane wasn't behind Quist. Crane had moved first. He was in and out of Crane's office in 11 minutes. The back window lock was exactly what he'd expected. Simple, old, the kind that hadn't been updated because nobody in Redstone Crossing would dare break into Virgil Crane's office. That belief was worth its weight in bad locks. The office smelled of tobacco and something else. Something slightly off. The specific staleness of a space where someone believed they were untouchable. Where the windows are never open because the man inside never feels the need to let the outside in. The desk was center of the room. Of course it was. Left drawer. Locked. Holt had opened harder locks in his federal years without leaving a mark. This one gave quickly, an old mechanism, worn down by years of use, which said everything about how seriously Crane took his own security. Men who believe they're untouchable stop worrying about locks. Inside, the ledger. Small, brown cover, worn at the corners. He opened it and felt the specific quality of recognition that comes from matching external evidence against an internal model. Every entry corresponded to what Sadie had described. Plot numbers, dates, amounts, names. Every number matched. He would have been less surprised if they hadn't. The filing copies. The letters. He read all 3 letters slowly. Standing in a dead man's office in the middle of the afternoon with 2 business associates waiting 20 feet away. And Quist somewhere between here and the ridge. Holt Brannon stood and read the words of Judge Elias Morrow, the first letter. The mechanics of the filing scheme, the second. A payment route, the third. The third letter discussed a specific case with the particular tone of a man who considers himself above the matters he arranges. Clinical, almost bored, as if the destruction of a family's livelihood was an administrative detail to be noted and moved past Fuller v. Crane Consolidated, filed Millhaven Circuit. Judgment to be returned in favor of Crane per our arrangement of the 14th. Confirm receipt of the agreed amount prior to the hearing date, and the matter will be concluded. Appropriately Fuller, Ned Fuller. Sadie's father. He stood there for a moment with the letter in his hands in the afternoon, quiet around him, and understood something about Sadie Fuller that he hadn't fully understood before, despite everything she'd told him. The full shape of it. Her father had walked into that courtroom, trusting that a floor existed, that certain structures held even when everything else didn't, that a judge was a judge, and the law and the world was hard, but some things could be counted on. And the floor had been sold. For $500, Holt folded the letters, placed them with the ledger in the inside pocket of his vest, locked the drawer back, went out the window. He was at the livery, getting the roan saddled when he heard footsteps behind him. Measured, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who wants you to know they're there before you see them. Because surprising you is less interesting than watching your face when you realize who it is. He turned Harlan Quist, standing 10 feet away, lean man, 40 years old, with the kind of face that gave nothing. Not because there was nothing behind it. Because he'd decided a long time ago that expression was a liability and trained it out of himself. He had a gun on his hip. His hand wasn't on it, yet thought that was your horse, Quist said. It is? You came back fast and needed to settle up with the livery. Paid short last time. A silence. The sound of a man who doesn't believe you and wants you to know it. Crane send you back? Holt asked. Crane sent me ahead. Said if I happened to see you, I should ask you something. Ask, where's the girl? Holt held the man's gaze. No change in his own face, not performance. Just the result of having already run this conversation multiple times in his head on the ride down. Left, he said. Took what wages she said. Crane owed her and headed east. Didn't tell me where, Quist took one step forward. Just one. Crane has a particular interest in that girl. Something she might have taken with her. A pause. Information's a kind of property, too. You probably understood that. Being a former federal man, the air in the livery changed temperature. Holt didn't move. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Sure you don't." Quist tilted his head, looked at the saddlebag. "Here's what I think, Brannon. I think you know exactly what she knows, and I think you ought to hand it over as a gesture of goodwill before this becomes a different kind of conversation." Holt looked at Harlan Quist for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "You're alone." Quist smiled. It didn't reach anything above the jaw. "Crane's a day behind me. Which means right now it's one gun against one gun. In a livery, where Corton over there has a scattergun he's had for 15 years, and very little patience for people who cause problems in his building." He let that sit, so before you finish the thought you're having, he said, "I'd ask you to run that math all the way through." Quist went very still. The specific stillness of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the result of. Holt put his foot in the stirrup, mounted. "Didn't hurry. Tell Crane I said hello," he said. "And tell him, if he's smart, which I've never been completely sure about, he'll be a long way from this county before the end of the month." He rode out of Redstone Crossing at a controlled pace. Because running invites a bullet and trotting suggests you have something to run from. He kept back strapped and his hands easy on the reins and waited until the last building dropped behind him before he let the roan run. His mind ran the calculations the whole way. Quist had seen the saddlebag. Quist would tell Crane. Crane would know Holt had been in the office, which meant Crane would move on the cabin. The question was only how fast, and Crane was already a day up the Northeast Trail, which meant the timeline had collapsed to almost nothing. He stopped that line of thinking by force and replaced it with trail math. Distance, elevation. Whether the roan could manage the lower switchbacks by lantern light, she could. She'd done it before. He kept moving. Dawn found him at the base of the upper trail. He dismounted and led the roan up on foot. Quieter that way. The last thing he wanted was the sound of hooves on stone announcing his approach. The upper switchbacks. The last ridge. The last bend. He stopped voices from inside the cabin. Two of them he knew, one immediately, the flat, measured tone of Harlan Quist. Which was wrong because Quist was behind him in Redstone. No, Quist had ridden the northeast route, the route Crane had taken. They'd come up together from the other side. Crane had pushed hard through the night on the northeast cutoff. A shorter route than the main trail, rough enough that most men wouldn't try it. They'd reached the upper ridge before dawn. The second voice, not Quist, older, heavier. A voice like gravel worked smooth by years of being used to deliver pronouncements. "Virgil Crane, here, already, here." Holt moved the last 30 yards without sound. Pressed flat against the cabin's west wall. The door was barred from inside. He could see the bar shadow through the crack at the bottom. Good, he moved to the east-facing window. The shutter was latched from inside. Simple hook and eye. He worked his knife blade into the gap. Lifted. Slowly and listened. Crane was talking. The voice calibrated to something almost gentle, almost paternal. The voice of a man who uses softness as a trap. "Smart woman. I always said so. That's why I kept you on as long as I did. Smart women are useful." A pause. Smart women who stop being useful are a different matter. She had made the calculation the moment she heard the second horse leave. One man, no backup. Shooting him here meant a body, and no witnesses, and no case. So she talked, and she waited. Sadie's voice came back flat and level. "I don't have anything of yours. Then you won't mind if Quist has a look around. Quist isn't here. A beat. It's just you." Another pause. "Longer. That's true," Crane said. And his voice dropped into something colder. Something that had stopped pretending. "Which means we can have a private conversation." No audience. The shutter latch gave. Holt eased it open an inch at a time. Crane's voice again, closer now. Moving toward her. "You've had some time to think, Sadie. I want to know what you think you're going to do. Go to the law? With what? A woman's word against mine and 2 witnesses who'll testify to whatever I pay them to say. Another step. I've built things here. Careful things. And you are not going to walk into a federal office with your memory and undo them. A silence, then Sadie. Why not? 2 words. Delivered without heat. Without performance. Just the actual question. Placed in the air with the weight of someone who already knows the answer and wants the other person to have to say it. Because it works, she said. And something in her voice had changed. The controlled evenness was still there. But underneath it, clarity. The clarity of someone who has decided to stop being careful and just be what they are. It works, and you know it works, and that's the thing that frightens you. Not me. The fact that the whole thing you built is less solid than you've been telling yourself. A beat of silence. What proof? Crane said. Very quietly, the ledger, she said. The filing copies. The 3 letters from Judge Morrow, including the one that discusses my father's case specifically. The silence after that had a density to it. The silence that precedes a decision being made that can't be unmade. Holt came through the window. One motion. Feet on the floor. Up. Gun drawn, what he saw in the half-second of assessment. Crane, 6 feet from him. Sadie turned toward the window now, surprise collapsing across his face. Sadie, standing between the table and the fireplace, the rifle at her side. Both hands on it, feet planted, eyes clear. She had him. She had been holding him the whole conversation with nothing but words and the weight of what she knew. She'd done it long enough for Holt to get through the window. 2 against 1 now. That was all. That was enough. The documents aren't here, Holt said. Level. Eyes on Crane. They're with someone who rides to Caldwell if I don't check in. So shooting either of us creates more problems than it solves. Crane looked at him. At the gun. At Sadie. At her rifle. She would have shot you, Holt said. You should know that, I know. Crane said. And the bluster was completely gone. What remained was something stripped down and tired. I know she would have. Sadewoody's voice came from his right, steady as stone. Sit down. On the floor. Both hands where I can see them. Crane looked at her for a long moment. The moment of a man taking account of exactly how much had changed. He sat down. Holt moved to Sadie's side. He checked the door. Quist's horse outside, but Quist still unaccounted for. Quist, he said low, rode ahead. While Crane came to the door, she said at the same volume, I heard 2 horses, 1 left. Probably watching the west trail. Of course she had tracked the horses. Of course. He went to the window and angled himself to see the approach without presenting a target. Nothing moving on the east trail yet. We have time, he said, not much. Then we use what we have. She looked at Crane on the floor. The man who had run land fraud across 3 counties. The man who had paid a federal judge $500 to ruin her father. Sitting on the planked floor of a 1-room cabin because she had held him there with the weight of what she knew. Here is what I know, she said. Not performing, not prosecuting, stating. The way you state something that requires no embellishment because the facts are sufficient. She recited the 12 land claims, plot numbers, false names, filing dates, the amounts in the ledger, the land office contact, the specific payments, the dates of Morrow's letters, the amounts, the specific language from the 3rd letter, the one about her father's case, word for word. Crane sat on the floor and listened. And somewhere around the 3rd minute, the specific change Holt had been watching for happened across the man's face. Not guilt. Something colder and more practical. The recalibration of someone who has just discovered the ground beneath them is less solid than they thought. What do you want? Crane said, flat. Transactional. All the performance finally gone. I want you to write something down, she said. Right now, a complete account. The names you used, the claims you filed, Morrow's involvement, Quist's involvement, all of it she let a beat pass. And I want you to sign it. That's a confession. Yes, it is. Why would I? Because, she said, and her voice was patient in the way that is more frightening than anger. The alternative is that we ride to Caldwell, with the ledger and the documents and my testimony, and you have no control over how any of it gets presented. A confession gives you the ability to frame it yourself, to say you cooperated, to be the man who came clean rather than the man who was caught. She held his gaze. Judges noticed that difference. Juries notice it more. Crane looked at Holt. Holt said nothing. Just looked back. She's right, Holt said finally. I've sat in enough courtrooms to know she's right. Another silence. Long and heavy with the weight of a man doing the arithmetic of the rest of his life. Paper, Crane said. And something to write with. Sadie turned to the shelf, took the small journal Holt kept for supply lists, opened it to a blank page, set it on the table with the pencil. There, she said. Crane got up off the floor slowly. Like a man 10 years older than he'd been that morning, he sat in the chair, picked up the pencil, held it over the page for a moment. Some last hesitation. Some final running of a calculation that had already come out the same way 3 times, and was not going to come out differently now. Then he started writing. If I write this, he said, Quist is going to know. Quist will know regardless, Sadie said. The only question is whether you're ahead of it, he wrote. Holt moved to the window and watched the east trail, still empty. He looked at Sadie. She was standing with her full attention on Crane, close enough to read every word, far enough to maintain the geometry of the rifle in her hands. Not watching with satisfaction. Watching the way a person watches something. They've been waiting a very long time to see and don't want to rush, now that it's finally happening. The writing took 20 minutes. Crane was thorough. More thorough than Holt had expected, which told him the man had been carrying the weight of it longer than he let on. And that setting it down had its own grim relief regardless of the circumstances in which it was happening. When Crane pushed the journal across the table, Sadie picked it up and read every word. Her eyes moved across each page with the focused precision of someone cross-referencing against an internal document that she trusted more than the one in her hands. She caught one omission, the Caverly parcels, she said. Plots 11 and 12, June of last year. You left them out. Crane looked at her. Write them in, she said. At the bottom he wrote them in. She read the additions, nodded once, sign it, and date it. He signed. Dated it. Sadie closed the journal, held it against her chest for a moment. Just a moment, the briefest allowance for what it represented, and then set it on the shelf beside the ledger and the letter copies. Now, she said, we need to talk about Quist, because Quist was the part that wasn't solved. Crane was cooperative. Defeated, not dangerous in the immediate sense. Quist was different. He won't negotiate, Holt said. No, Crane agreed from the chair. The word had a different quality now. The voice of a man who had stopped pretending. Quist doesn't negotiate. He finds the direct solution. How far behind you is he? Half a day when I came up. He was seeing to the horses. He'll have found the cabin by now. He knows the ridge. He'll come up the east approach. It's the only one he knows. Holt turned to Sadie. She had already set the rifle on the table, not putting it down, placing it where she could reach it in one motion, with her hands free, and was thinking. He could see the specific internal velocity she got when she was working through a problem. We can't stay, she said. No. We take Crane. Take the documents. Ride south to Caldwell before Quist can cut us off. 1 horse. Crane has a horse, bottom of the upper trail. The pines at the first switchback. He looked at Sadie. She looked at him. I'll ride with you, she said. No pause, no hesitation. The simple practicality of someone who has assessed the options and selected the functional one regardless of comfort. They moved fast. Holt bound Crane's wrists in front, not behind, because a man who can't use his hands can't control a horse, and a runaway horse on the upper trail was a problem nobody needed. He used rope from the supply shelf, firm but not punishing. Sadie packed the documents. Ledger, filing copies, letters, journal with the confession. All of it into the oilskin-wrapped section of the saddlebag. Her movements efficient and unhurried, in the way of someone completing a task they've been building toward for a long time. When she was done, she took one look around the cabin. A single sweep, fast, the kind of look that takes inventory and says goodbye at the same time. Then walked out the door. They collected Crane's horse from the pines. Holt helped Crane mount with his bound wrists, then mounted the roan himself. And Sadie put her foot in the stirrup and swung up behind him without asking for help, and her arms went around his waist with the practical grip of someone who understood the physics of riding double and had no interest in making it anything more than that. Cossetings, not romance. He was aware of this distinction very clearly. He was also aware that she was there, which was its own separate fact that he filed away for later. They went south. The first hour, nobody spoke. The trail did the work, keeping everyone focused on footing and direction, and the physical requirements of the moment. Then, against his shoulder, Sadie spoke low enough for only him to hear. The confession is solid. But a good lawyer argues Crane signed it under duress. He'd already thought about that. So had she, which is why she said, "My testimony needs to be airtight. Every number, every date, every name. In sequence. Without referring to the documents. So that when the documents confirm every detail, it's not a woman presenting papers she could have fabricated. It's a witness whose account was already on record before she ever saw the ledger." He thought about this. That's a different order than I was planning, I know. But it's the right one. He couldn't argue with that, which was becoming a pattern with her. "All right," he said. She settled back. He kept his eyes on the trail. They made camp once on the second day. Crane sat against a boulder, bound, staring at the fire with the expression of a man reviewing his life's decisions and arriving at unfavorable conclusions. Quist sat apart from everyone and ate methodically and looked at nothing in particular. At some point in the evening, Sadie came and sat beside Holt, not close, adjacent, which for her, was close. "When this is over," she said. He waited. "What do you do then?" He looked at the fire. "I go back to the ridge, check the cabin. Make sure it's squared away before hard weather. And then I figure out what comes next." "The ridge was a solution to a problem," she said. "The problem was that you didn't trust the system anymore. This case might change that, or it all falls apart in the courts." "Possible," she said. "Also possible the evidence is sufficient and the process holds." She met his gaze. "I'm a realist. I've calculated the probability that it holds." "It's higher than you're giving it credit for." He almost said something. Almost, then didn't. Because the thing he almost said was something he hadn't decided to say yet. "Get some sleep," he said instead. She looked at him for a moment. "You too," she said, and went to her bedroll, and he sat by the fire for another hour and stared into it and thought about what it meant to be certain you were done with something for 6 years, and then have one Tuesday in a dusty store change the entire calculation. Caldwell arrived in the late afternoon of the second day, bigger than Redstone by a factor of 10. Real buildings with real foundations. A main street that had been graded and graveled. Businesses with glass in their windows. A town that had made its peace with permanence 20 years ago and been making good on that decision ever since. Holt led them in from the North Road. Crane first, then Quist. Then the two of them on the roan, and that was when it went wrong, because Virgil Crane had not been sitting on his horse for 2 days doing nothing. He'd been thinking. Men like Crane are always thinking, even when they've signed confessions, even when they're bound. The calculating doesn't stop. It just changes what it's calculating. Dalshall. Ezra Taft was standing on the porch of the federal office with 2 deputies, and beside him, clean vest, fresh-shaved, expression of a man righteously aggrieved, stood Virgil Crane, except that was impossible, because Crane was 10 yards behind Holt on a gray horse. Holt processed this in about half a second. Not Crane. A man who looked enough like Crane from a distance to register. One of Crane's men from Caldwell. A place Crane apparently had a man because of course he did, and that man had told a story. Taft stepped down off the porch. "Holt Brannon," he said. Not a greeting, an identification. I have a complaint filed against you. Kidnapping, theft of private business documents, and assault of a citizen of Redstone County. Holt said nothing. I need you to step down from that horse. He stepped down, and I need the saddlebag. His jaw tightened. But the calculation was fast and clear. Resisting a federal marshal in front of 2 deputies and a main street full of witnesses led nowhere good. He unstrapped the saddlebag, handed it over. Taft took it, looked inside, looked at Holt, looked at Crane behind him, the real Crane, who had gone very still. Taft saw it. Something moved in his expression. Him too, Taft said to one of the deputies. Crane looked at Holt as the deputy moved toward him. And there was something in that look that hadn't been there before, a kind of grim recognition. Crane had underestimated the contingency planning of his own operation. Had not known about the man in Caldwell, which meant someone else had been running pieces of this, Morrow. This had Morrow's fingerprints on it. Holt was walked to the holding room at the back of the federal office. The door was closed, the lock engaged. He sat down on the bench and thought the documents were in Taft's hands. That was either catastrophic or ultimately irrelevant, depending on what happened in the next hour. A confession extracted under duress, from a man who could claim he signed under threat, with witnesses who would testify to Crane's bound wrists, was compromised evidence at best, without independent testimony establishing the same facts, without a witness who could stand in front of Taft and demonstrate knowledge that could not have come from fabricated documents. They had nothing except. He stopped. Except Sadie. He hadn't seen what happened to Sadie after he dismounted. Had been walked in too fast. She could be outside. She could be in another room. The lock engaged on his door meant he couldn't know, and there was nothing he could do from inside a locked room, which was the hardest thing he had felt in 6 years of learning to sit with difficult things. The door to the federal office opened. T. Fuller walked in. Nobody stopped her, which was either an oversight or. And she was banking on this, betting everything on this. Federal offices in functioning towns operated on the assumption that citizens could walk in and request to speak to someone in authority. She was a citizen. She had something to say. She walked to the front desk. A young deputy looked up, looked at her, did the thing people always did, took stock, made a judgment, let the judgment settle on his face in the way he probably didn't even know it settled. She was used to that look, had been used to it since she was 12 years old. It still cost something, every time. But she had learned, at considerable personal expense, that the cost was worth paying. Because the look was wrong. And she knew it was wrong. And, knowing it clearly and completely was the only armor she'd ever been able to afford. I need to speak with Marshal Taft, she said. Marshall's busy. I understand. Tell him a witness in the Crane matter is here and needs to provide testimony. The deputy looked at her for a moment, looked at his desk, looked at the door behind him. Wait here, he said. She waited. She used the time to organize everything she was about to say in the order she'd decided to say it, which took approximately 20 seconds, because she had been organizing and reorganizing it in her head for 2 years. The door opened. Dalzell Ezra Taft, 58 years old. Short, careful, the kind of face that had heard every possible story and was still waiting for one that surprised him. Eyes that moved over her with the same assessment the deputy had made and arrived at a different conclusion, not dismissal. Evaluation. You're connected to the Brannan matter, he said. I'm the reason there is a Brannan matter, she said a beat. Come in, Taft said. She sat down across from him. No papers in her hands, nothing to refer to, nothing to hold on to, just her and 19 months of things she had memorized in a dusty office in Redstone Crossing every morning, while Virgil Crane drank his coffee in the next room, and never once considered that the girl cleaning his desk might be reading every document on it and keeping every word. Tell me what you know, Taft said. All of it. Don't leave out the parts that seem small, So she did. She started with the structure. How the scheme worked. How land parcels along the Southwater Corridor had been filed under deceased claimants' names. How the signatures had been forged. How the filings had been processed through the land office by a contact whose name she gave, whose payment history she recited, whose specific role in the process she described with the precision of someone who had read the correspondence order entries 4 separate times. She gave the plot numbers, all 12. In filing order, she gave the dates. Each one, she gave the amounts. Every figure, Taft was writing fast. Not interrupting then the letters. She described the 3 letters from Judge Elias Morrow, the paper quality, the handwriting, the signatures, the dates, and then she recited them, word for word, all 3, including the 3rd one, the one about her father. She said the words, Fuller v. Crane Consolidated. Judgment to be returned in favor of Crane per our arrangement of the 14th. Confirm receipt of the agreed amount prior to the hearing date. And her voice was even through all of it. Every syllable. Every word, even fuller, even the date. Even, agreed amount $500 to bury her father's case, and everything that followed from it. She said all of it. Without stopping. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Taft looked at his notes. Looked up. You memorized all of that, he said. While working for this man. Yes. Over how long? 19 months. And no one knew. No one looked at me long enough to wonder, she said. Taft looked at her differently then. Not with pity, with the recalibration of a man who has just put someone in the wrong category and realized it. The documents in the saddlebag, he said. You've seen those documents. I've read every one of them. Multiple times. I can tell you their contents without looking at them. And your account matches them precisely, she said. Because they're accurate. And because I'm accurate, she held his gaze. Test me. Open the ledger to any page. Any entry. Ask me what it says. Taft looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the saddlebag on the desk beside him. Took out the ledger, opened it to a random page. Entry dated April 3rd, he said. Describe it. She described it. He checked. Read it again. Looked up. Entry dated July 9th. Same ledger. She described it. He checked, set the ledger down. Miss Fuller, he said. I need you to sign a formal statement. I've been ready to sign one for 2 years, she said. I just needed someone to be ready to write it. The deputy let Holt out 45 minutes after locking him in. He walked out into the main office. Taft was at his desk, writing with the deliberate focus of a man who has a great deal to record and not enough time. Crane was in one of the interview rooms, visible through the glass panel in the door, sitting across from another deputy, talking. The resigned, deflated quality of someone who has already decided how much to give and is in the process of giving it. Quist was in the other interview room, also talking. Quist talking voluntarily, to a federal marshal, when the alternative was being on the wrong side of a documented confession from the man who'd employed him. Was, it turned out, a very efficient process. Quist was tired. Not tired in the physical sense, tired in the deeper sense of someone who has been doing something carefully for a long time and has been running the permanent low-level calculation of when the precision stops being enough. That exhaustion had a particular quality, the exhaustion of a man who has finally gotten to stop. He talked for 90 minutes and gave them 7 additional names, including the land office contact, including 2 more people in Crane's network in adjacent counties. Including, and this was the one that made Taft set down his pen and look at the ceiling for a long moment, the name of a second judge. A state circuit judge out of Millhaven named Abner Cole, who had been processing probate cases for deceased landowners and routing their estates into Crane's filing scheme before the families could contest. The scheme was bigger than Sadie had known, which meant her 19 months of careful memorization had captured the core of it. The foundation, the letters, the ledger, the confession, large hands with calloused palms. But Quist's testimony was building on top of it in directions that changed the scale from significant to something that would occupy federal attention for the better part of a year. Taft sent a wire to the circuit court that evening. Another to the U.S. Attorney's Office the following morning. Judge Elias Morrow was relieved of his circuit duties 3 days later, pending investigation, which was the polite institutional way of saying that the ground had gone out from under 20 years of careful corruption, and everyone who had helped build it was now very busy deciding how far they were willing to fall. Holt walked out of the federal office into the late afternoon and sat down on the porch steps. Just sat. He was not fine, not wrecked. Somewhere in the specific middle space of a man who has been moving hard toward something for several days and has just stopped moving and doesn't know yet what to do with the stillness. He heard the door open behind him. Footsteps. Sadie sat down beside him. Not close, not far. The same adjacency as the campfire. "You're out," she said. 45 minutes ago, I know. I watched them let you out." He looked at her. "From where?" "The window in Taft's office. He let me stay while he processed everything. In case there were questions." She looked at the street. There were a lot of questions. He nodded. The main street of Caldwell moved around them. A wagon. 2 men talking outside the hardware store. A woman crossing with a basket. The street moved the way streets do, indifferent, continuous, completely unaware that anything had just changed inside the federal office behind them. "You didn't need me in there," he said. "No, you had it, I had it," she said. "But..." She stopped, started again. "When I walked out," she said, "I needed someone to be there." He looked at her. She was looking at the street. Her profile, the set of her jaw, the green eyes that were doing something unusual, not calculating, not managing, just present. Tired in the way of someone who has been carrying weight for so long that putting it down doesn't produce relief immediately, just absence. The strange lightness of a burden removed before the muscles have adjusted to not having it. "I was here," he said. "I know, a beat. That's what I mean," she said. 3 days passed. Holt stayed at the Caldwell Hotel, 2nd floor. Room with a window that faced west toward the ridge country. He could see the red rock ridgeline from that window on clear mornings, a dark edge against the pale sky. He looked at it every morning and tried to figure out what he felt when he looked at it. The answer was complicated. For 6 years, the ridge had been simple. The correct solution to the problem of his life. After Denison. Quiet, hard, asking nothing of him except the work of surviving it. Now when he looked at it, he felt something that wasn't quite belonging. Not anymore. Which was alarming. Which he was not going to say out loud. Which he was going to sit with. Until it made sense. Sadie had the room next door. He knew this because he could hear her moving in the mornings. Early, the same pre-dawn wakefulness she'd had on the trail. The same refusal to let the quiet hours go to waste. He never knocked. She never knocked. But in the narrow hallway going down to breakfast, they met most mornings. And those meetings had a quality, a specific, unnamed quality that he'd stopped trying to name and started just noticing. On the 4th morning, she knocked. He opened the door. She was dressed, hair pinned back in the practical way she'd developed since arriving in Caldwell, a folder of papers under her arm. And on her face, the internal processing look, the one that meant she'd already made a decision and was in the process of saying it. "Taft confirmed this morning," she said. "The federal review in tomorrow's cases opens in 3 weeks. That's fast." Quist's testimony accelerated it. The second judge, Cole, apparently has enough paper trail that the U.S. Attorney's Office was already looking at him peripherally. This gave them the connection. Holt nodded. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The Fuller land case," she said it, without changing her voice. Without giving it extra weight. But it took extra weight anyway. The way certain things do regardless of how carefully you carry them. With Morrow suspended pending investigation, the circuit is reviewing all contested judgments from his tenure. My father's case is on the list." He looked at her. "The land attorney here, a woman named Ruth Calder. She handles homestead disputes. I have an appointment with her this afternoon." A pause. "I wanted you to know." "I'll come with you," he said. Something moved in her expression. Quick and warm. "I wasn't asking, I know. I'm telling." She looked at him for a moment. 2 o'clock, she said. Ruth Calder's office was on the second floor of a building that smelled of paper and linseed oil, and the particular density of serious work done seriously over a long time. Calder herself was small and precise and somewhere past 50, with gray-streaked hair, and the manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of men who underestimated her and had long since stopped noticing or adjusting for it. She shook Sadie's hand first. Then Holt's. "Tell me everything," she said, "and don't leave out the parts that seem unimportant. In my experience, those are exactly the parts that matter most." Sadie told her everything, all of it. Calder asked sharp questions, the kind that went straight to the weak points, the places where evidence was circumstantial or process could be challenged. She tested every answer. Sadie pushed back twice, on points where she thought what Calder was being too conservative in her reading of the evidence. Calder looked at her the second time she pushed back, with an expression that was professional composure, warming by about 3 degrees. "You've studied the federal homestead regulations," Calder said. "I had access to Crane's reference copy," Sadie said. "He kept it to know what he was violating. I kept it to know what was being violated." Calder looked at Holt. Holt spread his hands slightly. He had nothing to add. She already knew everything he knew, and had organized it better than he had. Calder looked back at Sadie. "Here's what we can do." What they could do, it turned out, was significant. With Morrow's suspension creating the opening for review of his contested judgments, there was a viable motion to reopen the Fuller case. The timeline of the original filing, combined with the letter from Morrow's correspondence that Sadie had memorized, combined with Crane's confession naming the Fuller case, specifically, created a record sufficient to challenge the original judgment. It would take time. Everything took time. But the framework was there. "You'll need to stay in Caldwell for the duration of the review process," Calder said. "Minimum 6 weeks. Possibly longer, I understand. And after the review, follow-up proceedings. It could be months total, I'm aware." Calder paused. "Miss Fuller, what you're doing, placing your name on a formal challenge to a sitting federal judge's rulings, carries real risk even with Morrow suspended, even with Crane in custody. Men like that have networks." Sadie looked at her steadily. "I cleaned their names out of Crane's correspondence files too," she said. "I know who they are." A pause. Then Ruth Calder smiled. "Small, fast, real. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. "Moms, I'll have the initial motion ready in 10 days. They shook hands and walked out into the Caldwell afternoon. The street was doing its ordinary business around them. Holt walked beside Sadie, and neither of them spoke for half a block. Then Sadie said, "You're going back to the ridge, not a question." The tone of something she'd been carrying for days. He stopped walking. She stopped a half step later and turned to face him, and there it was. The conversation he'd been maneuvering around since they rode into Caldwell. "I need to," he said. "The cabin. Before hard weather. There are things," he stopped, heard himself. Started again. "The cabin will need to be squared away. Water barrel sealed. Provisions checked. Beams, the beams." She said yes. "Holt." He looked at her. "The cabin is a cabin," she said, not unkindly, just clearly. The way she said everything that mattered. "It will survive a few more weeks without you. It's survived 6 years, I know that. So. He stood on a main street in Caldwell in the late afternoon, with the ridge visible on the northern horizon, and the woman who had walked into the worst chapter of her life, carrying an entire case worth of evidence in her memory, and had just sat in a lawyer's office and started the process of getting her father's land back, standing 3 feet away from him, that were not calculating at her right now. Not managing, just waiting for him to be honest, which was, he was discovering, both the easiest and the most difficult thing in the world. "I don't know how to do this," he said, quiet. "Real, I know," she said. "I don't either, that's not reassuring." "No," she agreed, "but I know how to learn things. And you," she stopped, looked at the street, looked back. "You paid $20 for a principle and carried it 60 miles. That's not a man who doesn't know how to commit to something." He stood there. The street moved around them. "The case is going to take months," he said. "Yes, you'll be here. Yes, I could go back. Square the cabin properly. Make sure it holds through the winter." "All right. And then I'd need somewhere to be while I figured out what came next." "Caldwell has a hotel," she said, voice even, not giving him anything he hadn't offered first. "The rate is reasonable. I have some expertise on the subject now. You mentioned that, I did. A beat. A week," he said. "Maybe 2. To do it right, I'll be here when you get back," she said. Not a promise. Just true. Already decided. He nodded, she nodded, and then something happened that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them stopped. She reached out and put her hand on his forearm. Not gripping. Not holding. Just there. Briefly. The way you might touch someone's arm to stop them stepping off a curb they hadn't seen, except there was no curb. And no traffic. Just her hand on his arm for 3 seconds. And then gone. "Be careful on the upper trail," she said. "The north switchback gets loose after rain. I know that trail. I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Go," she said. "Before you talk yourself into not coming back." He went. He rode north with the sun behind him. Different from every other ride he'd made on that trail. The difference was direction. He was pointing away. And the specific, persistent gravity of what he was pointing away from, which was a feeling he had not felt in a very long time. He reached the cabin by mid-afternoon of the second day, exactly as they'd left it. Bar on the door from outside, provisions on the shelf, cold fireplace, 2 chairs at the table, the narrow bed, along the back wall where she had slept. And he had heard her breathing in the dark, and understood, for the first time in 6 years, that silence and solitude were genuinely different things. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then went in, built a fire, sat in his chair, and thought about what he was actually doing. What he was doing was deciding something. Not in the way of a man having a revelation. He had always been suspicious of revelations. Too much emotion, not enough evidence. This was the quieter kind. The kind that happens when you sit in a room, long enough to hear yourself think, and what you hear is not comfortable, but is simple, undeniable. Not because it feels good, because it's true. He had come to the ridge 6 years ago, because connection cost something he wasn't willing to pay, because caring about a place or a person created exposure, and exposure created loss. And loss had a specific weight he'd already carried once, and had made a calculation about never carrying again. He had been wrong about the math. Not wrong that connection costs something. Wrong that the cost was the reason not to do it. He looked at the 2 chairs. One of them was the chair he'd sat in every night for 6 years. The other had been empty for 6 years. And then for 3 days it hadn't been. And those 3 days were. This was the part he hadn't let himself look at until now. The 3 most fully alive he had been since he left Denison. Not because of the danger. Not because of the case or the ridge or the confrontation or any of the events. Because there had been another person in the room. A specific person, with green eyes, and a memory that held everything, and an iron spine that bent for nothing and had probably been bent before, and straightened itself out in the dark without asking anyone to witness it. And she had sat in that chair, and eaten his food and told him the truth about her father, and held a rifle on Virgil Crane, and walked into a federal office alone and recited 19 months of memorized evidence for 47 minutes without stopping. And then she had put her hand on his arm for 3 seconds on a main street in Caldwell, and it had cost more to ride away from that than anything the Ridge had ever asked of him. He worked for 2 days. The cabin got what it needed, checked beams, solid. Rechinked 2 sections of the west wall, sealed the water barrel, stocked the shelf against whatever winter came, cleaned the fireplace. He worked with the methodical attention of someone doing something properly, because it deserved to be done properly. Not rushing, not dragging, just doing the work. On the 3rd day, he packed the saddlebag. Stood in the doorway one last time. This place had been exactly what he needed. When he needed it, he didn't say goodbye. It wasn't the kind of place that required that. He barred the door from outside, mounted the roan, and rode south. He made Caldwell in a day and a half, pushed harder than his usual pace, didn't pretend he wasn't. Left the roan at the Caldwell stable and walked up the main street with the saddlebag over his shoulder. He was halfway to the hotel when he heard his name, turned. Sadie was coming out of Ruth Calder's building across the street, papers under her arm, hair pinned back. Moving with that particular quality she had. Not hurried, but purposeful, every step going somewhere. She stopped on the boardwalk when she saw him. He crossed the street. She watched him come, without moving. When he reached the boardwalk, she looked at him with the full, current operational capacity of those green eyes. And for once, for the first time since the trading post in Redstone Crossing, she wasn't running the calculation. She was just looking. "You're back," she said. "I said I would be. You said a week or 2. It's been 5 days." She looked at him. "You worked fast. I worked right," he said. "There's a difference." A pause. "The motion was filed this morning," she said. "Calder says the review board will take it up within the month. Your testimony about the railroad timeline and the economic structure of the scheme. It established motive and scale in a way that changes how the land fraud reads legally. Without that piece, it's opportunistic. With it, it's systematic." She paused. "You should know your part in this. Your memory built it," he said, "and your instinct got us here." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'm glad you came back," she said. Simple, direct. The way she said things that cost her something. He thought about the measured version of what to say next. The safe version. The one that didn't commit too much or arrive too fast. He thought about 6 years of practiced restraint, about Dennison, about the specific cost of walking away from something that needed him, about 2 chairs at a table, one of them empty. "I'm not going back," he said. "Not the same way." She went still. "The cabin is squared away. It'll hold." He paused. "But there are things here I don't want to miss." She looked at him for a long moment, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen before. Because it was not one she had shown him. It was unguarded in the way that the rifle-steady hands and the iron spine and the precise memory never were. Underneath all of it, younger. Less armored, real. "That's the most words you've said at once," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I'm aware," he said. She shifted the folder of papers under her arm, looked at the street, looked back at him. And then she made the decision the way she always made decisions, not impulsively, not reluctantly, but with the clear-eyed commitment of someone who has looked at the evidence and arrived at the only honest conclusion. "There's a vacant lot," she said. 2 blocks east of Calder's office. I walked past it this morning. It's the right size, good corner. Morning light comes from the south." She looked at him carefully. "The kind of lot that suits a small restaurant, a real kitchen. Tables that are actually level. You've thought about this." "I've thought about it for 3 years," she said. "I just didn't have the circumstances until now." Calder mentioned she handles property sales as well. In passing, said, "Yes." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you, because you asked me once what I was going to do next. This is what I'm going to do." "I know," he said. "You don't have to." "Sadie," she stopped. "I'd like to look at the lot with you," he said. "If you want a second opinion." She was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that," she said. They walked east together, 2 blocks. And the lot was there. Just ground, just possibility. A corner with good morning light. and enough space for something real. They stood looking at it, the afternoon settling around them, the street doing its ordinary business, the late light in Caldwell making everything look slightly more permanent than it was. "Good bones," Holt said, something he'd heard builders say and had never had occasion to use before. "Good location," she said, "close to the federal office. Federal witnesses need somewhere decent to eat." He looked at her. She was looking at the lot, and the corner of her mouth was doing something. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "After the case," he said, "after all the proceedings. When it's finally done, it will still be here," she said. "And so will I. No hedge in it, no question mark. Just the shape of something she'd already decided." He stood beside her on a vacant lot in Caldwell with the ridge at his back, and 6 years of deliberate solitude behind him, and the clear, simple understanding that solitude had never been what he actually wanted. It had been what he'd settled for when wanting felt like it cost more than he had. "It didn't feel that way now. I'll need somewhere to stay," he said. "If I'm here for a while." "The hotel is on the next block," she said. "Rate is reasonable. You mentioned I have expertise." "You do." A pause. "Holt?" "Yes, you know how to build things," she said. "Not a question. 6 years alone on the ridge. You learn so." She looked at the lot, looked at him. "I cook. You build. We figure out the rest as we go." He thought about it. He thought about it for about 4 seconds. "That's a reasonable arrangement," he said. She almost smiled. He saw the almost. And this time he let his own almost go all the way. Just barely. Just enough they stood on the lot in the late afternoon light and didn't say anything else. Because there wasn't anything else that needed saying yet. There was only the ground beneath their feet and the building that didn't exist yet and the future assembling itself out of evidence. They had both been gathering, without knowing they were gathering it. Holt Brannan had ridden into Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday for salt and coffee. He had come out of it with something he hadn't budgeted for, hadn't planned, wouldn't have predicted with any model he knew how to build, and wouldn't have traded for anything the ridge had ever given him. And Sadie Fuller, who had stood in a trading post with her eyes on the floor and the names of 12 fraudulent land parcels, and 3 letters from a corrupt judge locked in a memory that had never once failed her, had walked out of the worst year of her life. Not because someone had come for her, because she had decided to leave, and had been waiting for a man principled enough to open the door. She had found one, he had found her. And on a Tuesday afternoon in Caldwell, on a vacant lot 2 blocks east of a land attorney's office, they began, carefully, practically, and without any fanfare whatsoever, to build something that would last.